Yeah, thank you so much, Simon, for this nice introduction, and also for the Ruhr University for hosting me. Okay. Between 2005 and 2007, the American filmmaker James Benning set up his camera next to the railroad tracks across the United States. He filmed landscapes and freight trains running through them. RR for railroad shows trains flowing horizontally and vertically through the image, sometimes from the right, sometimes from the left, in their entirety. This can take as long as 11 minutes. Okay. Now, Benning kept his camera still to capture the flow of goods. He traveled to the countryside to capture freight trains on film. The length of the trains corresponds to the length of the film time. One sequence is one freight train. You can guess the quantities of raw materials and goods, commodities that are transported from A to B without seeing them. It was only after filming next to the railroad tracks for 2 years and watching the cars go by that he realized that the railroads are part of the infrastructure of capitalism, James Benning said. What do we learn about historical concepts such as industrialization or globalization when we look at them from the sideline, from the history of logistics? This question was the starting point of a long-term research project that kept me busy for almost 15 years, I must say. The impetus for my journey into logistics was the observation that since the 1990s, a material object, a specific material object, has not only become the most frequently chosen motive for representing logistics, but also for the global economy. The object I'm talking about is the container. The container represents the credo of just in time. Goods should always be mobile rather than kept in stock. But the just in time credo was not new when it emerged in the 1990s in writings such as those of management guru Peter F. Drucker, which proclaimed the so-called postmodern factory. Peter F. Drucker wrote his book during the so-called second globalization, the commercialization of the internet, and at a time when the personal computer became available on the mass consumer market. In the 1990s, logistics managers and engineers began to talk about supply chain management. They modeled the company as information network operated by computers controlling production, storage, transport, and distribution. But these technological and economic developments were based on old ideas. The just-in-time system developed by Toyota in the 1960s. This production concept was based on the philosophy of eliminating waste and maximizing efficiency in the consumption of resources in several respects, in terms of personnel, production space, investments in machinery, tools, and inventories. Although just-in-time reversed the geopolitical condition by adopting a concept from Japanese business in Europe and the United States for the first time and led to a considerable Japan shock in the German and American automobile industry in the 1970s and 80s, the transnational relationships are much more complicated. I should move forward. Okay. The Toyota manager Taiichi Ono was inspired by American supermarkets when he had the idea to invent the Kanban cards. During a study trip to General Motors and other automobile factories, he had observed that customers were walking around the store with basket, picking the goods off the shelf themselves. And what we see here is really the core of the Toyota system, the Kanban card. They are, when a good is needed or an item is needed, it is ordered directly and it's not produced in advance. But we must even look further back. The vision of material flows became a crucial one in the 1920s already. The vision was directly linked to the idea of a Ford conveyor belt with continuous production lines. The idea was to transfer material flow beyond the factory to the warehouses and transportation. What you see here is an advertisement by the transportation company, Automatic Transportation Company in Chicago of 1945, which produced forklifts. The plant is linked to the transport facilities. The forklift and the pallets serve as intermediary. But the vision of material flows was based on even older ideas dating back to the early modern period. The metaphor of flow is a culturally well-established symbol used by economists since the Enlightenment. At the beginning of the 20th century, the engineering sciences were able to align with this metaphor. Their program aimed at making production, storage, and transport processes more fluid. When I speak of metaphors of flow in economics in the early modern period, I do not just mean the well-known analogy of the model of the economic cycle with the model of the blood circulation by William Harvey. In this context, I also refer to the American economic historian Philip Mirowski and his argument developed in the book More Heat Than Light. He argued that economics has made significant use of physics and vice versa in the formulation of economic thought, and in particular in the mathematical formalization of economics. The idea of production, circulation, and consumption as developed by the French physiocrats, for example, François Guénet, with the distinction between productive and non-productive sectors, were shaped by mechanics and fluid mechanics. Simon already mentioned last year I published a book that is aimed at a wide audience. I didn't expand on the underlying theoretical and methodological consideration, but rather hint at them in the relevant places where they become central to the analysis of the material. This is, by the way, how historians deal with theory generally, as you might have noticed. Today, I will try to reverse the approach. I will make the methodological and theoretical considerations somewhat more explicit. The term material flow I have borrowed from my sources. It's a term used by engineers since the beginning of the 20th century, long before logistics came into wider use. The choice of the title is, however, also programmatic and aims at the critical review of the concept of global circulation and flow, which is often used in global history. Flow has now become not only a buzzword in the globalization discourse, but also a guiding metaphor for global history. Browsing through the bookshelves of global history, one occasionally gets the impression that the language of the object of investigation, globalization, has been incorporated directly into the meta-narratives, global history. The idea of flow was sometimes also accompanied by the idea of the elimination of real places, but not always, I must admit. As Stuart Alexander Rockefeller has argued, cultural anthropologists studying globalization processes also made extensive use of metaphors of flow. I counter this trend with the methodology developed in SDS since the 1980s. I have been pursuing the idea of potentially extending the analysis of science and technology to the whole of society, and thus also crossing the fragmentation into specialized subdiscipline, for example, economic history, political history, and the history of technology, since a long time, actually since my first books, My History of X-Rays. Well, I have first discussed my approach for the book in a short essay for the journal Geschichte und Gesellschaft. The methodology was very much inspired by both Michel Serres and Bruno Latour, and especially his early monograph Science in Action from 1987. The methodological frame is in the subtitle, How to Follow Scientists and Engineers Through Society. It is not primarily the actors who are followed, as the title suggests, but rather their practices, the expedition, collection, inscription, and controversies, the communication channels and written records that document, store, and disseminate the research practices. Or in my case, as I would argue, follow the material flows and supply chains through societies. I will say a little bit more about that later. What does this mean for the methodology of a history of logistics? I cannot dwell only on companies because logistics cannot be reduced to the consequences of corporate activities like the ones of Kühne und Nagel. To name one global player in the field, you may know him because he's funding soccer clubs, but also universities. Well, firstly, I have chosen to study anonymous things, knowledge formations, and media operation of logistics as my primary objects of investigation. Secondly, I have used the moment of Stillstand, which is not perfectly translated with the word standstill, which has us so preoccupied during the pandemic. And I use it as an epistemic trick. And thirdly, I focus on the handling of time and the control of time in logistics. To the first point, this focus on materiality and mediality is useful because since the 1920s, the material flow engineers have started precisely with materiality in their activities to produce material flows with small things that are mass-produced, standardized, and applied on a large scale. And by doing so, they fabricated a logistical effect, or logistics, if you want. R.L. Lockwood, he was a Department of Commerce employee in the US involved in work simplification, described this process in 1929 as follows. Little things which multiplied many times became big and important things. With the help of forklifts, containers, transport platforms, labeling templates, belt and ramps, the acceleration and movement could be increased, and the standardization and interchangeability of transport and storage devices established. Logistics was not more than a vision, the idea of a coordinated, controllable, planned movement of material and also information. But precisely because the vision of material flow was rather a presumptuous idea formulated with little regard for tradition and supported by engineers, it was so strong. And that is the argument of my book. Logistic is also strong because it is materially anchored in society, if you will. The concept of time and space organizing material instruction introduced into the discussion was introduced into discussion by media studies scholar Cornelia Wisman is very helpful in this context. Material instruction are complex, technical, and socially influential processes, and they are essential in logistics. To my second point, as Stillstand, I use the temporary Stillstand as an epistemic trick. This is because material flows can be best studied historically at the places where they have come to a temporary standstill. This epistemic trick of a heuristic of disruption is often used and developed by STS scholars and historians of science and knowledge. A recent event in contemporary history illustrates this heuristics of disruption. After the first report of an unknown disease in China appeared in the media in January 2020, governments around the world began to impose lockdowns from March 2020 onwards. The virus spread around the world at the speed of light. It relied on global transport logistics. Business people and tourists who were used to moving freely between countries suddenly became immobilized. Borders were closed and employees were pushed to their home offices. Well-established supply chains were interrupted. Anyway, the supply chains, they were suddenly exposed. And that's the moment when we can look at them and they are exposed in a moment of disruption. Because certain production processes had long been outsourced, because many countries were unable to produce urgently needed products domestically because of a lack of raw materials and spare parts, because production plants were closed or the production slowed down, because demand for certain items suddenly rocketed to an extent that no logistician could have imagined. Disinfectants, masks, substances for PCR tests, etc. A year later, the next interruption occurred completely unexpectedly at one of the bottlenecks of the world economy. Ever Given became a mass media super event with symbolic images of the Stillstand of material flows that no picture agency could have commissioned more aptly. As I have already mentioned, images of packed container ships have been used to represent the global economy since the late 20th century. Whenever there are reports on world trade, growth, or criticism of globalization, media outlets like to use the container ship as symbol. But the images that appeared in the media channels in March 21 broke with that conventional narrative of the container motive. They showed the giant container ship Ever Given filled with containers which had run aground in the Suez Canal. 1 year after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, Ever Given had blocked the shortest shipping route between Asia and Europe. It is no wonder then that the media, in describing the logistical risk in global capitalism, have drawn deeply on the metaphorical reservoir of the threatened human organism, which has been anchored in economic thought since the early modern period. They spoke of a stranglehold on the Suez Canal. In contrast, the image that we see here, and many others have been produced, the images of the Ever Given turned sideways almost seemed like the harmless Lego game. However, it's not so much the spectacular events such as the lockdown or the Ever Given grounding that are at the center of my analysis, but rather the spaces of Stillstand that are central to logistic, the warehouses. Because historically, material flows can be best examined at the places where they are temporarily at the standstill, when goods, raw materials, and semi-finished products are stored and reloaded, when they are stranded or miss their destination, where they are evaluated, stacked, tagged, and marked, but also where the material flow is first mathematically modeled, graphically sketched, and integrated into the workflow. Here you see an image of the first distribution center of Switzerland, Coop. Distribution center, a modern type of warehouse, a distribution center connected to the newly built highways And this is also important, organized by IBM systems. The period when before the material flow is set in motion, or the moments when it temporarily comes to a halt or comes to a standstill, are often the occasion for conflicts, and these conflicts are written down. Practices have to be documented, or work processes and new technologies can be recorded in images and writing. Or they even serve as a motive for advertisement, as you can see here. This is an advertisement for IBM. They use the warehouse as a motive to make the argument for less labor, which is never happening. You have still a lot of labor actually in warehouses. This is also very interesting. We can discuss this later. And the ad was, this is an ad made by the studio GGK, a very famous one in 1971. I come to my third point, studying the handling of time and the control of time in industrial and post-industrial societies. Historians like E.P. Thompson, who have studied the relations between time, work discipline, and industrial capitalism, have emphasized how crucial the control of time is for industrial capitalism. As early as 1967, Thompson pointed out how the measurement and control of time became an important economic factor. Thompson used a technically sophisticated but not deterministic argument to describe how the clock synchronized the sense of time, production practices, and the everyday life of workers in the industrial capitalism between the 17th and the 19th century. And he also described how time became a currency in the process. As Thompson noted, I quote Thompson, "The employer must use the time of his labor and see it is not wasted. Time is now currency. It is not passed, but spent." End of quote. I argue that logistics is responsible for the diffusion of the coordination of time and space beyond factories by including transport, distribution, and even end users. Therefore, an analysis of the processes that ensure that time and space can be synchronized in the first place is central to a socio-technical understanding of logistics. The concepts of material instructions, dingliche Handlungsanleitung in German, by Cornelia Wisman, also die dingliche Handlungsanweisung that organize time and space, is helpful here again. And infrastructure theory is helpful too for grasping time-space synchronizations. Researchers in SDS, such as Susan Lee Starr, have argued that infrastructures should be understood as highly relational entities that include people and things alike. Starr emphasized the importance of social structures for the emergence and maintenance of infrastructure. And that is also a difference between Fissmann and Starr. That Starr looks very much also as at the social technological relation, and Cornelia Wisman is much more interested in the media, in the things. However, the SDS researcher also made clear that while societies shape infrastructure, they also largely are determined by them. Once infrastructures are in place, societies become heavily dependent on them. Because infrastructure are often very long-lived, it is crucial to focus on the temporality of infrastructure. When is an infrastructure? Starr, like Fissmann, emphasized the translocal and the transtemporal character of infrastructure. I quote, "Infrastructure has reached beyond a single event or one-side practice." The American historian of science and computing, Paul Edwards, has recently expanded the spectrum of analysis of temporality against the background of digital infrastructures. He turned the question, when is an infrastructure, into the question, how fast is an infrastructure? And what are the time frames of infrastructures? The question of the acceleration of processes is highly relevant for a history of logistics. In particular, the question arises as to the phases of acceleration and their social causes and consequences. Methodologically, Starr's observation that infrastructures are often only perceived by society when they break down or collapse is extremely significant. And again, this is the reason why we have to study Stillstand to understand the flow. A crucial tool for modeling flows for engineers was and still is the flow chart, or the process chart, how they were also called. Here you see a flow chart, an early one from a manual from the US military during World War II. The flow charts created with templates and typewriters depict a clear message. Operation, transport routes, storage processes, and inspection should be reduced, distances shortened, and working hour decimated. Flowcharts were used in management consulting as tool of analysis, communication, and regulation. This multiple function of flowcharts are the reason for their success far beyond their original fields of application in business and military. In the 1950s, flowcharts crossed the Atlantic and were integrated into business schools in Europe. They became symbols of rationalization, seen as easy-to-use recipes against complexity, as a tool for data collection, and as a roadmap for planning. But without the material standards developed since the 1920s, forklifts, pallets, and many more, the flowchart as a form of representation and knowledge would not have been applicable. Yeah. It's early in the morning. The material flow suggested in the flowchart is based on material culture. Everything has to flow. The use of the flow metaphor also function as a tool to naturalize complex socio-technical and socio-economic processes. They become inevitable and logic. The material flow metaphors reflect a top-down view. They reflect a perspective that delivers an overview of confusing situations in the world characterized by mass production. With industrial mass production, coordination and synchronization became crucial, and that's the reason why logistics became so powerful. Material handling engineers developed the tools for spatial management and temporal synchronization of raw materials and commodities. Anonymous things like the Euro palette are highly political objects. The Euro palette not only represented tools for rationalization processes, but also created political spaces by connecting location and nations. The first picture, the one here, shows the instructions for US soldiers and their allies during World War II. And this is the moment where the palette has been invented and also widely distributed around the world. And this picture, you might remember it, shows David Cameron, who tried unsuccessfully to campaign for a remain in the European Union. He used the Euro palette as an established symbol of a unified Europe established during Cold War. Packaging science also contains social norms and conflicts. The arrows on packaging not only serve to rationalize the gaze in the interest of acceleration, but also provided techniques for controlling and discipline devices to control packers and transport workers. Here you see two examples of the huge collection of Hans Rudolf Lutz, a Swiss graphic designer who collected thousands and thousands of packages designed in the 70s and 80s. The warehouses and storage facilities, in particular the grain elevators captured by James Benning, were also a source of criticism of capitalism. Although logistics was never understood as part of the political sphere, on closer inspection it becomes clear how much politics there is in a Tetra Pak, for example. While the conservation of materials and raw materials was understood as part of packing rationalization, until, I would say, World War II, the principle of single-use packaging, the optimization of packaging weight, and the space and wide optimized packaging form based on plastics meant that the once inherent economical use of resources fell out of favor. It was only in the 1970s when the environmental movement reminded us that the disposable principle had not only perfected the material flow of post-war societies, but had also produced mountains of rubbish. As early as 2012, a book by an anonymous collective calling itself the Invisible Committee had been published in France, which stressed not only the political dimensions of logistics, but also argued that logistics is at the bottleneck of modern societies and could be a target and a tool of resistance. But you have to be able to run the infrastructure for your own benefit. Otherwise, the blockade makes no sense, the collective argued. At the same time, social theorists also began to explore logistics as a vehicle of resistance. Fred Nielsen published a paper on the power of logistics in 2012. He concluded his use with a statement that was as fatalistic as it was militant. Working with and against a logistical system has become a crucial political task of the present, end of quote. I think we feel the same as Fred Nielsen using infrastructures and logistics. We all work with and against technical systems. We can't do without them, but we shouldn't stop to think about how to organize them differently, better, at least temporarily disconnecting from the systems, from the infrastructures, from logistics is often the last only solution. I think we should try more the Stillstand. Thank you for your attention.